It was just another ordinary day at the boutique, until an elderly woman, dressed simply and quietly, walked in. The store owner, Michael Matthews, barely gave her a second glance. He assumed she was just another customer who couldn't afford anything. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't just any woman. She was the CEO of a billion-dollar fashion empire. The moment she walked out, Michael had no idea his entire world was about to be turned upside down. Would he survive the consequences of his mistake? Keep watching to find out. Before we start, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more awesome stories. Mrs. Edna Harper stepped into the boutique on a quiet Thursday afternoon, her cane tapping rhythmically against the polished marble floors. She was dressed simply, in a beige cardigan and gray slacks, her white hair neatly pulled back into a bun. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be an elderly woman, just another customer who might wander in for a quick look and then leave. But as she walked past the rows of expensive clothing, none of the store staff paid much attention. Michael Matthews, the young owner, stood behind the counter, glancing up only briefly before turning back to his phone. He didn't even look at her long enough to make an assessment. He had seen her type before, older, plain, and unassuming. In his mind, she didn't belong in a store like his, a place where only the young and the wealthy dared to shop. As Mrs. Harper walked deeper into the store, she passed displays of luxury jackets, fine wool scarves, and leather shoes, each one carefully placed to highlight the elegance of the boutique. She lingered for a moment by a coat that caught her eye, but no one approached her. The sales assistants, busy with their own tasks, ignored her completely, as if she were invisible. Michael, watching from the counter, let out a quiet sigh. He was used to seeing people like her come and go, people who would never make a purchase. They wandered into his store for a brief escape from their dull lives, only to leave disappointed. In his world, the real customers were the well-dressed businessmen and women who walked in, ready to spend thousands without a second thought. Mrs. Harper, however, didn't seem fazed. She gently ran her fingers over the soft fabric of the coat, as if contemplating something more than just the price tag. She made her way to the next section of the store, where an assortment of dresses hung, each one more extravagant than the last. The staff continued to ignore her, and Michael noticed her lingering near the back, where a sale rack stood, offering items at discounted prices. His assumption was quick. She's looking for a bargain, not serious about buying anything. He didn't see the woman who had built an empire with her own two hands. Instead, he saw a frail, elderly customer who likely couldn't afford a single item in his boutique. As Mrs. Harper moved toward the front of the store to exit, she paused, catching Michael's eye. She hesitated for a brief moment before speaking in a soft, respectful tone. "Excuse me, do you have any information on this coat?" she asked. Michael, annoyed that she had interrupted his scrolling, glanced up, his face tight with a forced smile. He immediately sized her up, dismissing her with one swift glance. "Oh, that one?" he replied, looking at the coat with little interest. "It's on sale, but it's really not for someone like you," he said, nodding toward her simple attire. "It's a high-end piece, you know. Maybe you should look around the clearance section in the back." The words stung, though Mrs. Harper remained composed. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she nodded quietly, turned, and slowly walked toward the door. Michael, having already forgotten about her, turned his attention back to his phone, already distracted by the next notification. The sound of the door chiming as it closed behind her went unnoticed. He simply didn't care. The next few days passed quietly, and the incident at the boutique slowly slipped from Michael Matthews' mind. He was busy with the store's operations, constantly checking on inventory, planning marketing strategies, and dealing with his staff. His boutique had been gaining popularity in the area, attracting young professionals with its high-end merchandise and chic atmosphere. To him, It was just another ordinary day, filled with customers who knew their place and the type of service they deserved. But Mrs. Edna Harper wasn't like the others. Michael hadn't given her much thought after their brief exchange, but he was about to realize just how wrong he had been. It was late one morning when the phone rang, the sharp, professional voice on the other end of the line immediately catching his attention. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews. This is Laura from Harper Fashions. Mrs. Edna Harper would like to schedule a private appointment at your boutique. She's interested in a few pieces for her upcoming collection." Michael blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Harper?" he repeated, his mind racing. Harper Fashions. The name felt familiar, but he couldn't place it right away. It wasn't until Laura mentioned that Mrs. Harper was the CEO of the fashion empire that the pieces clicked into place. His heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who he had so casually dismissed the other day. Mrs. Edna Harper wasn't just any elderly woman. She was one of the most powerful and influential figures in the fashion industry. She had built her empire from the ground up, a black woman who had shattered barriers and changed the face of fashion, creating an inclusive, high-end brand adored by celebrities, designers, and customers alike. The realization hit Michael hard. He tried to collect his thoughts, but his mind was still racing. Of course, he stammered. "We would be honored to have her visit. Please let her know we'll prepare everything for her." He quickly hung up the phone, panic rising in his chest. He had just insulted a woman who could not only ruin his reputation, but potentially end his business if she chose to speak out. The embarrassment was almost unbearable, but he knew he couldn't afford to let his mistake slip by. Michael immediately began to rush around the boutique, telling his staff to get everything ready for Mrs. Harper's arrival. He instructed them to pick out the best clothes, clean every surface, and make sure the boutique looked immaculate. The truth was, he had no idea how to properly welcome someone of her stature, but he was determined to redeem himself. As the day wore on, his anxiety grew. He had no idea what to expect from her, but he feared that she would see through his flustered efforts and remember the way he had treated her. The thought of facing her again made him uneasy. Little did he know, Mrs. Harper wasn't just coming to visit, she was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The day of Mrs. Harper's scheduled visit finally arrived. Michael stood by the door, his nerves getting the better of him as the clock ticked down. He had spent the morning pacing, ensuring that every inch of the boutique was spotless. His staff had done their best to arrange the best pieces of clothing, putting out only the finest items. It was almost laughable how far he was willing to go, all in an effort to impress a woman he had already disrespected. When the door opened, Michael's heart skipped a beat. There she was, Mrs. Edna Harper. But this time she was different. Gone was the simple cardigan and gray slacks she had worn before. Instead, she was dressed in a tailored black dress, her presence radiating grace and confidence. The change in her appearance struck Michael immediately. Her demeanor was no longer that of the quiet, unassuming elderly woman he had dismissed so easily. No, she stood tall, commanding attention without saying a word. Michael felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He forced a smile and quickly moved toward her. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harper," he greeted, trying to sound professional despite the tightness in his chest. She nodded slightly but didn't say anything at first. Her eyes, though, scanned the boutique, taking in every detail, noticing the efforts Michael had put into preparing for her arrival. "Please, allow me to show you around," he said, eager to please but also desperate to hide his earlier mistake. He led her through the store, showing her the pieces he had selected, though his mind was preoccupied with what was to come. He kept waiting for the moment when she would reveal that she knew exactly who he was, that she had already figured out his lack of respect for her. But Mrs. Harper didn't say a word. She simply observed, moving from one display to another, her hands lightly grazing the fabrics. As they made their way through the boutique, Michael began to feel the weight of her silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was enough to make him question every decision he had made. Why hadn't he treated her with the same respect as his other customers? What had he been thinking when he dismissed her so quickly? He tried to shake off the guilt, but it kept creeping back, especially as he noticed the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Do you like any of these pieces?" Michael asked, hoping to engage her and steer the conversation into safer territory. But Mrs. Harper's response was measured, almost careful. "They're very lovely," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "But I'm not here to shop, Mr. Matthews. I'm here for something else." Michael's brow furrowed slightly. He hadn't expected that response. "Something else?" he repeated, unsure what she meant. Mrs. Harper's gaze remained fixed on a beautiful silk blouse displayed in front of her, but her words were pointed. "I'm here because I believe in change. I believe in respect, integrity, and fairness. These values should be the foundation of every business, especially in a place like this." The weight of her words settled heavily on Michael. He didn't understand it yet, but he was beginning to sense that this wasn't just about clothing. Mrs. Harper was here for more than just shopping. She was here to make a statement, and he was about to learn what that statement would be. Michael stood there, trying to process Mrs. Harper's words. The silence in the boutique grew heavier, his mind racing. What was she really saying? Was she questioning his business practices? Was this all some kind of test? His anxiety spiked again. He had barely begun to recover from the embarrassment of their first encounter, and now it seemed as though she was already challenging him on a deeper level. "Change?" he repeated, struggling to find the right words. I believe in those values too, Mrs. Harper. Of course, we strive for excellence and respect in this store. We're always improving, always looking to make things better." Mrs. Harper didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded and continued to look over the store, her eyes not missing a single detail. Michael, desperate to salvage the conversation, continued with a bit more enthusiasm. "We take customer service very seriously here. We try to ensure everyone feels welcome. I know I didn't give you the best impression last time, but we really value all our customers. And I want you to know that—" "Do you?" Mrs. Harper interrupted softly, her voice calm but firm. She turned to face him, her eyes locking with his in a way that made his words falter. It was like she was seeing right through him, and he wasn't sure if he liked it. "You see, Mr. Matthews," she began, "I've been in this industry for decades, building something from nothing. I've faced every kind of prejudice imaginable, and I've watched people like you decide who belongs in spaces like this, based on their clothes, their skin, their age." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've seen it all, and I've learned that real change doesn't happen by simply saying the right things when it's convenient. It happens when we're tested, when we're uncomfortable. It happens when we challenge the system we're part of." Her words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. He hadn't expected her to confront him so directly, and he certainly didn't expect her to be so honest about her own experiences. As she spoke, he felt a mix of shame and frustration building within him. He had heard plenty of speeches about inclusivity and respect in the business world, but they had never felt as personal, as real, as they did coming from her. "Look around, Mr. Matthews," she continued, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of years of experience. "Your store may look beautiful. It may offer high-end products and attract a certain type of customer. But do you truly understand what it means to offer respect to everyone who walks through those doors? Not just the ones who can afford to spend thousands on your merchandise, but the ones who may not fit your idea of your type of customer." Michael didn't know what to say. The truth was starting to sink in. He had been part of a system that ignored people like Mrs. Harper, that judged people based on how they looked or what they could afford. And worse, he had been complicit in it. He had treated her the way so many others had likely been treated, dismissively, unfairly, based on assumptions he had no right to make. Mrs. Harper paused for a moment before speaking again, her voice much quieter this time, but still laced with authority. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty, Mr. Matthews. I'm here to show you what happens when we start treating people the way they deserve to be treated. I hope you understand that soon. I'll be leaving now, but I'll be back." With that, Mrs. Harper turned and walked toward the door. Michael stood frozen, watching her leave, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. As the door chimed softly behind her, he was left alone with his thoughts, questioning everything he thought he knew about his business, about his customers, and about himself. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain. Mrs. Harper had just planted a seed of change, and whether he was ready for it or not, it was about to grow. The next few days were a blur for Michael. After Mrs. Harper's visit, everything felt off. The boutique, which had once seemed like his domain, now felt foreign to him. He couldn't stop thinking about her words, how she had challenged him in a way he hadn't expected. He kept replaying their conversation in his mind, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Her calm authority had unsettled him, and the guilt he felt from their first interaction gnawed at him. But Michael, being who he was, tried to push the thoughts away. He had a business to run after all, and life had to go on. However, something wasn't right. The staff, who had always been upbeat and focused, seemed to sense the tension in the air. Conversations felt stilted, and the energy in the boutique had shifted. Michael found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, half expecting Mrs. Harper to walk back in at any moment, but she didn't. Days passed without a word from her, and while he tried to get back to normal, the discomfort remained. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. It was plain, unmarked except for the words "Harper Fashions" stamped in bold on the top. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he opened it. The contents were short but packed a punch. "Dear Mr. Matthews, this letter serves as a formal notice that you and your boutique have been selected for a special partnership opportunity with Harper Fashions. Mrs. Edna Harper will be arriving tomorrow to discuss the details. Please ensure the boutique is ready for her visit, as she will be accompanied by her senior team. Best regards, Harper Fashions." The words seemed to blur together as Michael read them again. A special partnership? Mrs. Harper was coming back, but this time with her team. He immediately felt a mix of excitement and dread. Was she really interested in partnering with his store, or was this a setup to call him out for his behavior? His mind raced with possibilities. He quickly put the letter aside, forcing himself to calm down. There was no time for nerves. If she was truly coming back, he had to be prepared, and this time he would do whatever it took to show her he had learned his lesson. The hours leading up to her arrival were filled with frantic energy. Michael instructed his staff to ensure everything was perfect, more perfect than before. They rearranged displays, dusted every corner, and polished the glass windows until they gleamed. He even called in extra staff to greet Mrs. Harper properly, worried that if they failed this time, it would be the end of his boutique. As the clock ticked closer to the scheduled time, Michael found himself pacing in the back of the store, rehearsing what he would say. He had to make it clear that he understood now, that he respected her and what she stood for. He had to prove he wasn't the same arrogant man who had dismissed her so carelessly days ago. The door chimed as it opened, and Michael's heart leapt into his throat. Mrs. Harper was standing at the entrance once again, her presence unmistakable. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, a group of well-dressed individuals entered, their confidence matching hers. Michael's stomach dropped. These were her senior team members, people who were likely as successful and influential as she was. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, but he knew this was his chance to make things right. Mrs. Harper gave him a small, knowing smile as she walked toward him. "Good to see you again, Mr. Matthews," she said, her tone still calm, but carrying the weight of someone who had seen and done more than most could imagine. "Thank you for coming back, Mrs. Harper," Michael stammered, struggling to find his footing in the face of her powerful presence. I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I just want to say, I'm sorry. I didn't treat you the way you deserve to be treated. I've learned a lot from what you said." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened, but there was no warmth in her expression. It was a look that seemed to say, "I'm glad you're starting to understand, but it's not enough yet." "I hope so, Mr. Matthews," she replied, her voice steady. "But words are easy. Let's see if you're truly ready to back them up." With that, she nodded toward one of her team members, who handed Michael a sleek black folder. "This is the proposal," Mrs. Harper continued, her gaze never leaving his. "Let's sit down and talk about what kind of partnership you're offering Harper Fashions." Michael opened the folder, his hands shaking slightly. As he flipped through the pages, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about selling clothes anymore. It wasn't just about business. It was about proving he had changed, and that he was ready to be held accountable for his past actions. But as he glanced up at Mrs. Harper, he knew something much bigger was at play here. She wasn't just giving him a chance to redeem himself, she was giving him an opportunity to transform his entire business. And somehow, he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. As Michael sat across from Mrs. Harper, the weight of her gaze was undeniable. The silence in the room was thick, and every word he spoke felt measured, carefully considered. His staff, who had gathered nearby, kept their distance, aware of the gravity of the moment. Mrs. Harper's team, standing behind her, observed quietly, their expressions unreadable. Michael felt exposed, unsure of what to expect next. He opened the folder, trying to focus on the proposal in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the way Mrs. Harper had challenged him before. He could feel her watching him, studying him, and it made him nervous. It was as if she were silently judging every move he made, every word he said. After a moment, Mrs. Harper finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Tell me, Mr. Matthews, what do you think makes your boutique stand out from the others, Wamkur?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. Michael hesitated. He'd always prided himself on the exclusivity of his store, the high-end products, the polished service, but now, with Mrs. Harper sitting across from him, it felt like those answers weren't enough. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting for more than just a surface-level response. I guess I'd say it's the quality of the merchandise and the experience we provide," he began, fumbling with his words. "We cater to a certain clientele, people who appreciate fine clothing. Our staff is well-trained, and we always make sure the store looks pristine. Mrs. Harper raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's what I thought. Your boutique is focused on status, but what about substance? What do you offer to those who aren't part of your certain clientele, as you call it?" The question hit Michael hard. He hadn't expected her to challenge him so directly. His mind raced. He had never really thought about it like that before. He had always catered to the wealthy, the ones who could afford to buy expensive items. He never considered the people who might come in, not to purchase, but just to experience something different. Michael started, but the words caught in his throat. He was realizing, with a sinking feeling, that he hadn't built a business based on inclusivity. He had built it around a narrow vision, one that excluded anyone who didn't meet a certain standard of wealth, appearance, or status. Mrs. Harper watched him carefully, waiting for him to find his words. When he didn't respond right away, she continued, "I don't need you to tell me what your store looks like or how many expensive products you have on display, Mr. Matthews. I already know that. I need to know what you're going to do now. How are you going to make sure that your store isn't just another place that caters to the rich and dismisses everyone else?" Michael swallowed hard. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something deeper, values, integrity, and fairness. And he realized that he had a long way to go before he could call himself a true businessman. The boutique was just a shell, a facade that had hidden the truth. It wasn't built on respect for all people. It was built on the assumption that only a certain kind of person deserved to walk through its doors. The realization stung, but as Mrs. Harper continued to look at him, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe he could start building a business based on something more meaningful, something that didn't exclude people based on their age, race, or status. "You're right," Michael said quietly, looking down at the folder in his hands. I, I've been running this place all wrong. I've been focused on the wrong things. I haven't built it with inclusivity in mind. I've been blind to that." Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "You've started to understand, Mr. Matthews, but that's just the beginning. There's a long road ahead of you, and it's not going to be easy. The question is, are you ready to take it?" Michael looked up at her, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. He had to prove that he could change, that he could turn his boutique into something more than just a store. It had to be a place that welcomed everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "I am," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I'm ready." Mrs. Harper didn't smile, but her eyes softened just slightly, as if she could see the sincerity in his words. She then turned to her team and nodded. "Let's move forward with this partnership, Mr. Matthews. But remember, this isn't just about money. It's about creating something that truly reflects the values we believe in." As the conversation shifted to the details of their partnership, Michael felt the weight of the responsibility he was about to take on. He had no idea how he was going to make all the changes necessary, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. It was just the beginning, and there was a lot of work to do, but for the first time, he was ready to face it head on. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for Michael. The partnership with Harper Fashions was officially underway, and he had a lot of work ahead of him. Mrs. Harper's visit had left a lasting impact on him, and he had spent every waking moment thinking about how to turn his boutique into something more inclusive. No longer was he focused solely on luxury and exclusivity. He was beginning to see that real success came from creating a space where everyone, no matter their background, felt welcomed and valued. Michael had to rethink every aspect of his business. He started by having open conversations with his staff, asking them for input on how they could make the store more inclusive. It wasn't just about the merchandise anymore. It was about creating an environment where people from all walks of life could feel comfortable shopping. He wanted to create an atmosphere where every customer, whether they could afford to buy something or not, felt like they belonged. The first step was to rebrand the store's image. Michael brought in new signage, more welcoming and less pretentious. The store's website was revamped to include a broader range of customers, showcasing more affordable options alongside the high-end pieces. They also introduced special events aimed at attracting a wider variety of customers, from young professionals to families who had never felt like they were welcome in such a place. But the biggest change came when Michael decided to expand the store's offerings to include local artisans and small designers from diverse backgrounds. He reached out to the fashion community, inviting new talent who hadn't had the opportunity to showcase their work in high-end boutiques. This decision wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt when it felt like the new direction wasn't aligning with the original vision of the boutique. Michael questioned whether he was compromising his brand, but every time he did, he thought back to Mrs. Harper's words. She had shown him that true success wasn't about maintaining the status quo. It was about evolving and challenging the norms that held back so many talented individuals. As he began implementing these changes, the atmosphere in the boutique started to shift. The staff seemed more engaged, and customers noticed the difference. Word began to spread about the store's new direction, and slowly, people started to feel like they could come in and be themselves without fear of being judged or ignored. It wasn't perfect, but Michael was seeing the beginnings of something real, something meaningful. Despite the positive changes, Michael still felt the pressure of Mrs. Harper's initial visit. He knew he had a lot to prove, not only to her but to himself. The partnership with Harper Fashions meant everything to him now. It was his chance to show that he could lead with integrity and create a business that stood for something more than just profit. He worked tirelessly, adjusting his approach, learning from his mistakes, and striving to live up to the expectations set by Mrs. Harper. Then, a month later, Mrs. Harper returned for another visit. This time, there was no nervousness or anxiety in Michael's chest. He was ready. He had put everything he had into making the boutique a place of change, and he hoped she would see the difference. When she walked in, there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. She no longer had that quiet, calculating air about her. Instead, she seemed genuinely pleased. "Well, Mr. Matthews," she said, glancing around the store, "I have to say I'm impressed." Michael's heart lifted. He had been waiting for her approval, though he knew that true validation would come only from the impact of his actions. Still, hearing those words from her felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Mrs. Harper took a slow walk through the boutique, nodding at the new changes, the fresh displays, the variety of customers who now felt comfortable browsing the racks. She even stopped to talk to a few customers, asking them about their experiences in the store. Each interaction was warm, casual, and respectful, the kind of treatment she had been advocating for all along. "I see you've been making real progress," she said after a few moments, turning back to Michael with a small smile. "This is exactly what I hoped for when we talked. It's not about the clothes or the price tags. It's about how you treat people. And you've started to get it right." Michael stood there, his chest swelling with pride. He still had a long way to go, but in that moment, he knew he had made a difference. The changes he had implemented weren't just for the sake of business, they were for something greater. He had learned to see people for who they were, not what they wore or how much money they had. He had learned that true success was about creating a space where everyone felt welcome, respected, and valued. But Mrs. Harper wasn't done yet. She looked at Michael, her eyes steady and full of purpose. "Now that you've taken the first steps," she said, her voice low but commanding, "it's time to take things even further." Michael's curiosity piqued. He wasn't sure what she meant, but he was ready for whatever challenge came next. After all, he had learned that change was a process, a continuous journey that didn't end with a single decision or victory. And as Mrs. Harper spoke next, Michael knew that the true test was only just beginning. Mrs. Harper's gaze held steady on Michael as she spoke, her voice calm, but with an underlying authority that made him listen intently. "You've made the right moves, Mr. Matthews, but change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I've been watching you, and while I can see your efforts, I want you to understand that what you've done so far is just the beginning. To truly make a lasting impact, your store has to reflect the values we're talking about in every corner, not just in the front." Michael nodded, though a part of him still wasn't sure what she meant. He had made significant strides in his business. The store's new offerings, the shift in how customers were treated, the more inclusive atmosphere, it had all come a long way. Yet Mrs. Harper was telling him that there was more to do, and somehow he knew she was right. There was always more to be done. "I think it's time for you to take a more active role in the community," Mrs. Harper continued, her words carrying weight. "You've focused on internal changes, and that's a good start. But now you need to show the world who you are, what you stand for. People need to see you standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. You're not just selling clothes, Mr. Matthews. You're selling a message of inclusivity, respect, and empowerment. And that message needs to be heard loud and clear." Michael absorbed her words carefully. He had thought that simply changing his boutique's image and making his customers feel welcome was enough. But now he understood that it wasn't enough just to make his store a better place. It had to be a symbol, a leader in the industry for change. And that would require more than just fine-tuning the store's offerings. "How do you propose I do that?" Michael asked, feeling both eager and uncertain. The idea of pushing his business into the public eye, of really taking a stand, seemed like a daunting task, but at the same time, it felt necessary. Mrs. Harper had already shown him the importance of stepping out of his comfort zone, and now it was time to put her lessons into practice. Mrs. Harper smiled, a hint of approval in her expression. "You start by giving back, Mr. Matthews. Show the people around you that you care about more than profits, that your boutique isn't just about luxury, it's about supporting your community, about making a difference. It's about showcasing young talent, helping those who are underrepresented, and standing up for people who are often overlooked." Michael's mind began to race with ideas. He had already reached out to diverse designers, but what if they could take it further? What if they could partner with local charities, support underprivileged communities, or host events that focused on empowerment? He realized that there were so many possibilities, so many ways to truly integrate the values of respect and inclusivity into the very fabric of his business. "Think about it," Mrs. Harper continued, sensing Michael's growing understanding. "You're part of a larger network now. Harper Fashions is a global name, and with your store's new direction, you have the potential to inspire other businesses to follow suit. You could hold fashion shows that highlight emerging designers from marginalized communities, or host events that bring awareness to issues like discrimination and inequality. You could be the one to show the world that fashion doesn't just belong to the elite, it belongs to everyone." As she spoke, Michael felt a spark of inspiration. This wasn't just about rebranding his boutique. This was about using his platform to challenge the entire fashion industry and bring about real change. He had been given a powerful opportunity, one that not only could change his business, but also make a tangible difference in the world. "You're right," Michael said, the realization settling in. "This isn't just about running a business. It's about creating something bigger, something that stands for more than just making a sale." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened with approval. "Exactly. And now it's time to take the next step. You need to start making noise, Mr. Matthews. You've got the platform, the opportunity. Don't waste it." With those final words, Mrs. Harper stood up and motioned to her team, signaling that the meeting was coming to a close. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, Mr. Matthews. I hope to see you rise to the occasion." Michael stood, his mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The weight of the responsibility she had placed on his shoulders was heavy, but for the first time, it felt like the right kind of weight. He was no longer simply running a store, he was leading a movement, and this was his chance to change the game. He couldn't let it slip through his fingers. He had a vision now, not just for his boutique, but for the future of fashion, and he was determined to make it a reality. The days following Mrs. Harper's visit felt like a turning point for Michael. He had been given a mission, a purpose that extended far beyond the confines of his boutique. No longer was he just managing a high-end store. Now, he was in the business of change. His thoughts constantly swirled with ideas of how he could give back, how he could create a space that not only sold clothes, but empowered people, especially those who had been overlooked by the fashion industry. He began reaching out to local charities, organizations dedicated to helping marginalized communities, and young designers who had struggled to find a platform. He wanted to partner with those who needed it most, to give them the visibility and recognition they deserved. It wasn't easy. Some organizations were skeptical, and a few designers hesitated, unsure of what he could offer. But slowly, one by one, they began to see the sincerity in his efforts. Word spread about the boutique's new direction, and soon Michael found himself meeting with people who believed in his vision. One of the first events Michael organized was a fashion show dedicated to emerging Black designers. It was a bold move, especially in an industry that had often excluded talent based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status. But Michael was determined to show that fashion wasn't just for the rich and powerful, it was for everyone. The event was held in the boutique, with models walking the runway in stunning designs that were fresh, bold, and unapologetically unique. The turnout exceeded expectations. Customers who had once walked into the boutique, unsure if they belonged, now felt like they were part of something larger. There was a palpable sense of excitement in the air as people from all walks of life gathered to witness the talent that had been hidden for far too long. The event didn't just showcase fashion, it showcased a movement. It was a reminder that creativity and style knew no boundaries, no labels, and no limitations. After the event, Michael received an outpouring of support. Customers, many of whom had been skeptical at first, began to express their gratitude. They appreciated the changes he had made, not just to the store, but to the industry as a whole. They saw the heart behind the boutique, and it resonated with them. For the first time, the boutique was more than a store. It was a statement. But Michael knew that this was just the beginning. The success of the fashion show gave him the momentum he needed to keep pushing forward. He began organizing more events, each one focused on giving a platform to underrepresented voices in fashion. He reached out to other boutiques, hoping to inspire them to follow his lead. Slowly but surely, Michael was building a community, not just around his store, but around the idea that fashion could be a force for good. One afternoon, after a particularly successful event, Michael received an email from Mrs. Harper. He opened it, his heart pounding with anticipation. The email was short, but the words held so much meaning. "Mr. Matthews, I've been following your progress closely, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. You've taken the challenges I gave you to heart, and you've used them to create something truly meaningful. Keep pushing the boundaries and don't stop now. The world is watching, and you have the power to make a difference. Best, Edna Harper." Reading those words filled Michael with a sense of validation he hadn't realized he was seeking. Mrs. Harper had been a guiding force in his journey, and now, seeing her approval, made him feel like he was on the right path. He wasn't just running a business anymore, he was part of something much bigger. The pressure was still there, but now it felt like a responsibility he was ready to bear. Every decision he made, every event he planned, was a step closer to realizing the vision he had for his boutique. It wasn't just about selling clothing, it was about changing the narrative around what it meant to be in fashion. He was showing the world that fashion wasn't exclusive. It was for everyone, and anyone with the talent and the courage to pursue it deserved a chance to shine. As he reflected on everything he had learned, Michael knew there would still be challenges ahead. There would be people who doubted him, who resisted change, who were set in their ways. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of those challenges. He had a clear vision now, and he was ready to face whatever came his way. The journey had only just begun, but Michael was no longer the man who had dismissed Mrs. Harper. He was the man who was going to change the industry, and nothing was going to stop him. The months that followed brought even more success than Michael could have anticipated. Word of his boutique's transformation spread across social media, where influencers, fashion enthusiasts, and even journalists began taking notice. Michael's commitment to inclusivity was paying off in ways he hadn't expected. Customers from all backgrounds were coming in, not only to shop, but to experience a store that reflected their values, a space that embraced diversity, authenticity, and creativity. One of the most significant changes was the relationships Michael began to forge with other business owners in the area. At first, many of the local boutiques and high-end shops were skeptical of his new direction. They couldn't understand why he was focusing so much on emerging designers, local talent, and community events. To them, it seemed like a risk. Too much focus on inclusivity might alienate their traditional, high-end clientele. But as Michael's store gained attention, the skepticism began to fade. Several other boutique owners reached out to him, expressing interest in working together to promote diverse voices in the fashion world. It was a sign that Michael's vision wasn't just a passing trend, It was something that had the potential to reshape the industry as a whole. One afternoon, after a particularly successful event featuring a group of young designers from marginalized communities, Michael sat down with his team to discuss their next big move. The boutique had become a hub for the creative community, and they were ready to take things even further. "All right, everyone," Michael began, his voice steady but filled with excitement. "We've come a long way, but we're not done yet. I think it's time for us to take this movement to the next level. We've been talking a lot about giving back to the community, about making sure we're supporting emerging talent, but now it's time for us to really show the world that fashion can be more than just clothes. It can be a platform for change." He looked around at his team, the people who had been with him every step of the way, who had supported his vision, even when things weren't going as smoothly as he had hoped. They were all on board, eager to take things to new heights. "What do you think about hosting a charity gala?" Michael continued. "We could partner with local organizations to raise money for initiatives that support diversity in fashion, scholarships for young designers, mentorship programs for underrepresented voices, things like that. We can make a real difference, and we'll do it in style." The team responded with a resounding yes. The idea of using fashion not only as a business, but also as a way to create positive change, was something they all believed in. They began planning the event immediately, working out the details to make sure it would be a glamorous yet meaningful evening, one that would showcase the talent they had been championing all along, while also raising funds for causes that aligned with their mission. As the date of the gala approached, the excitement in the boutique grew. Michael's vision was becoming a reality. He had gone from a man who had almost ignored Mrs. Harper's challenge to someone who was now spearheading a movement in the fashion world. And it wasn't just about clothes, it was about culture, about lifting others up, about giving people a voice who had been denied it for far too long. The night of the gala arrived, and the boutique was transformed. Elegant lights twinkled along the walls, and models showcased designs from the very designers who had once struggled to get recognition. The atmosphere was electric, filled with excitement and anticipation. Local celebrities, influencers, and community leaders filled the room, eager to support the cause. Michael could hardly believe how far they had come. As he stood at the front of the room preparing to address the crowd, he felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. He had been given the opportunity to make a real impact on the fashion industry, and now, standing before a room full of people who shared his vision, he knew he had done something special. He wasn't just changing his business, he was changing the industry. When Michael took the stage, the room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "Tonight isn't just about raising money. It's about raising awareness. It's about showing the world that fashion isn't just for the privileged few. It's for everyone. It's for the creators, the dreamers, the visionaries who have been overlooked for far too long. And tonight, we're here to celebrate them." The crowd erupted into applause, and Michael could feel the weight of his journey lifting as he spoke. This was his moment, his chance to show the world the power of inclusivity in fashion and how one small change could spark a movement. The rest of the evening was filled with excitement, laughter, and celebration. The gala raised more funds than Michael had anticipated, and it also solidified his place as a leader in the new wave of fashion. He had taken a boutique that once catered exclusively to the wealthy and turned it into a space that embraced creativity, diversity, and equality. The impact was undeniable. As the night drew to a close, Michael found himself standing outside the boutique, looking up at the sign that had once seemed like a symbol of elitism, but now felt like a beacon of hope. He had come a long way since the days when he had dismissed Mrs. Harper, and he couldn't help but feel proud of the journey he had taken. He thought back to their first meeting, to the challenge she had given him, and to everything that had happened since. It had been hard, at times, to see the path forward. But now, as he stood outside the boutique, watching the last of the guests leave with smiles on their faces, he knew he had done it. He had changed the game. And in doing so, Michael Matthews had become more than just a boutique owner. He had become a champion for change, using his platform to make the world of fashion more inclusive, more accessible, and more fair for everyone. As the weeks passed after the charity gala, the boutique continued to flourish. The success of the event had exceeded all expectations, not just in terms of fundraising, but in its ability to further solidify Michael's reputation as a leader in the fight for inclusivity within the fashion world. It was becoming clear that the changes he had implemented weren't just benefiting his store, they were reshaping the entire industry. More designers, especially those from underrepresented communities, started reaching out to Michael, eager to collaborate with him and showcase their collections in his boutique. Michael had made it clear that he was open to talent from all walks of life, and the response was overwhelming. As he met with these designers, he realized that their stories were often just as inspiring as their work. Each one had faced challenges, some of them unimaginable, just to get their creations seen by the world. Michael had heard countless stories of rejection, discrimination, and barriers that were nearly impossible to break through. But now, thanks to the platform he had created, they had a place to be seen and heard. Michael was proud of what he had built, but he also knew that the work wasn't done. His mission was much larger than simply turning a profit. It was about breaking down the barriers in an industry that had long been defined by exclusivity and elitism. One afternoon, as Michael sat in his office looking over new proposals from potential designers, he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Mrs. Harper. "Mr. Matthews," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "I've been keeping up with your progress, and I'm impressed. You've taken the challenge seriously, and I see that your vision is beginning to take shape. But there's still a lot of work to be done. I think it's time for us to discuss the next step." Michael's pulse quickened. He had been waiting for this moment. Mrs. Harper had been an invaluable mentor to him throughout this process, and he knew that whatever she was about to suggest would be a game changer. "What's the next step?" he asked, eager to hear her thoughts. Mrs. Harper's tone shifted, becoming more focused. "You've already made an impact in your local community, and you've begun to change the culture within your boutique. But now, it's time for you to take your message beyond that. It's time for you to start influencing the broader fashion industry. You've proven that inclusivity works. Now, it's time to make sure everyone knows it." Michael listened intently. What Mrs. Harper was suggesting was exactly what he had been hoping for, an opportunity to expand his reach and make an even greater impact on the industry. He had always known that his boutique's success wasn't just about selling clothes, it was about changing the way the world saw fashion. "What do you have in mind?" Michael asked, his voice steady. "I want you to think bigger," Mrs. Harper replied. "It's time for you to host a National Fashion Week event, one that celebrates diversity, inclusivity, and emerging talent from all backgrounds. This won't be a small affair. It will bring together designers from across the country, and it will showcase the kind of fashion that the mainstream industry has too long ignored." Michael was silent for a moment, absorbing the enormity of what Mrs. Harper was proposing. A National Fashion Week? It sounded ambitious, even overwhelming, but at the same time, it felt like the next logical step. It was exactly what he had been working toward all this time. "You're asking me to lead something this big?" Michael asked, his voice a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Absolutely," Mrs. Harper said firmly. "You've shown that you're capable of creating change, and you've proven that people are ready for it. This event will put the fashion world on notice. It will force them to pay attention to the voices that have been silenced for so long, and I believe you're the person who can make that happen." Michael's mind raced as he considered everything involved: the logistics, the designers, the media, the public. It was going to take everything he had to pull off something of this scale, but he also knew it was a challenge he couldn't turn down. It was exactly what the industry needed, a bold statement that would shatter the status quo. "I'm in," Michael said without hesitation. "Let's do it." Mrs. Harper chuckled, clearly pleased with his response. "Good. I'll be here to support you every step of the way. But remember, this is bigger than just one event. This is about changing the way the entire industry operates." As the conversation ended, Michael sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He knew that this National Fashion Week would be the most ambitious undertaking of his career, but it was also the opportunity of a lifetime. He had been given the chance to lead a revolution in the fashion industry, one that would elevate voices that had been ignored for far too long. The work ahead would be daunting, but Michael was ready. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of fashion itself, and he was determined to make sure that everyone had a place at the table. The weeks that followed were a blur of non-stop meetings, planning, and organizing. Michael had officially set the wheels in motion for the National Fashion Week event, and the scale of what he was attempting to pull off was becoming clearer by the day. His boutique, once a small local gem, was now the epicenter of a movement that had the potential to reshape the entire fashion industry. His team worked tirelessly, handling everything from logistics to public relations. They reached out to designers from all over the country, carefully selecting talent that reflected a broad spectrum of identities, cultures, and backgrounds. Michael made sure to give special attention to emerging voices, those who had struggled to break into the mainstream industry. This event was going to be their moment to shine, and Michael was determined to give them the platform they deserved. But as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. The fashion world was notorious for being unforgiving, and while many supported his vision, others remained skeptical. There were whispers in the industry that a fashion week focused on diversity and inclusivity was a risk, that it wouldn't attract the kind of high-profile attention that more traditional shows garnered. Michael had heard the rumors, but he wasn't deterred. He had seen firsthand the hunger for change, both from the public and from designers eager to be seen. The world was ready for this, and he knew it. He spent hours reviewing each designer's collection, making sure that everything aligned with the values of the event: innovation, authenticity, and a commitment to challenging the norms that had long dominated the fashion world. Every detail mattered. Each runway show, each model, each piece of clothing was a statement. Michael was creating a space where beauty was defined by diversity, not conformity. As the event date drew closer, Michael's nerves grew. There was so much riding on this, not just for him, but for every designer who had trusted him with their vision. He couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. He knew that this event had the potential to change the industry forever, but only if it was executed flawlessly. One evening, as Michael sat in the boutique reviewing final plans with his team, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Harper. "I know you're busy, but I wanted to remind you of something important. This event isn't just about breaking the fashion world's mold. It's about breaking hearts and minds. You're not just showing people something new, you're making them feel something. Don't lose sight of that. The power of this event lies in its authenticity." Michael stared at the message, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't enough to just have diverse designers and inclusive runway shows. This event had to be real. It had to make people feel, make them question everything they thought they knew about fashion. It wasn't just about putting on a spectacle, it was about creating a moment that would forever shift the industry's mindset. As he put his phone down and looked around at his team, he knew he had to focus. He had to make sure the message was clear, not just through the designs, but through every moment of the event. The world needed to see that fashion could be a force for good, a space for creativity, and a place where everyone, regardless of their background, had a seat at the table. The night before the event, Michael stood in the middle of the boutique, now transformed into a temporary runway space, his mind racing. Everything was in place, but it didn't feel like it was enough. As he stared at the empty seats and the empty runway, he suddenly realized that it wasn't about how many people were in the room, it was about the change that would ripple out from that room into the entire world. This wasn't just a fashion show. This was a revolution. The morning of the event, the city was buzzing with excitement. The media had caught wind of what Michael was trying to do, and the buzz was palpable. For the first time, major outlets were starting to pick up on the idea of a fashion week that wasn't just about luxury or high-end exclusivity, but about inclusion and innovation. This was the event everyone had been waiting for, whether they knew it or not. As the doors to the venue opened, Michael felt the weight of the moment. His team had done their part, and now it was time to show the world that the fashion industry was ready for something new. The runway lights flickered on, the music started, and the first model stepped out onto the stage. The crowd fell silent as the first collection, bright, bold, and unapologetically diverse, walked down the runway. Michael held his breath, watching the faces in the crowd. He could see the shock, the awe, the excitement. This was something different, something real. As the night wore on, the collections showcased the beauty of diversity in ways the fashion world had never seen before. Models of all shapes, sizes, and ethnicities graced the runway, showcasing designs that broke free from the confines of traditional fashion. There was a rawness to it, an authenticity that resonated with everyone who was watching. This wasn't just a runway show, it was a statement, and the world was listening. By the time the final designer's collection had walked the runway, the room was electric. The applause was deafening, not just for the designers, but for the movement that had been sparked. Michael stood at the back of the room, taking it all in. It had been a success beyond anything he had imagined. But as he watched the crowd, he knew that this was only the beginning. The fashion world was on the verge of something transformative, and Michael Matthews had just helped lead the charge. As the evening came to a close, Michael's phone buzzed again. It was Mrs. Harper. "You did it, Mr. Matthews. The world is watching. You've made a statement. Now keep making it." Michael smiled, knowing that Mrs. Harper had been right all along. This event wasn't just about fashion. It was about showing the world that change was possible. And as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, he knew that the fashion world would never be the same again. In the days following the National Fashion Week, the world of fashion began to shift in subtle yet undeniable ways. The media coverage was intense, with headlines proclaiming Michael Matthews' event as a turning point for the industry. Fashion editors, influencers, and celebrities all expressed their support for the event, praising its diversity and the powerful statement it made about inclusion in a world that had often felt too exclusive. The buzz was everywhere. Social media was flooded with posts celebrating the designers, the models, and the new era of fashion that had been unveiled that night. Michael sat in his office, going through countless messages of congratulations. He had worked so hard to get to this point, but now that the event was over, the true impact of what had been achieved was starting to sink in. It wasn't just the applause from the crowd that mattered, it was the conversations that were taking place across the fashion world. Designers who had once been pushed aside were now being sought after. The models who had walked the runway, representing a broad spectrum of sizes, shapes, and ethnicities, were being celebrated. The movement he had started was no longer just his, it was growing, and it was resonating with people in ways he had never expected. But with all the success came a new set of challenges. Michael knew that the fashion world wasn't going to change overnight, and the industry was never going to be free of its deep-seated biases. He had sparked a movement, but it was only the beginning. There were still people who would try to resist change, who would try to hold on to the old ways of doing things. Michael couldn't afford to be complacent. The work was far from over, and he knew that the true test of his vision would be how well he could keep the momentum going. The pressure was mounting again. This time, however, it wasn't fear or doubt he felt. It was determination. He had started something, and now he had to make sure it wasn't just a fleeting moment in the fashion world. It had to be a permanent shift, one that would redefine the very foundation of fashion. As Michael sat back in his chair, he thought about how far he had come since his first encounter with Mrs. Harper. She had seen something in him that he hadn't even realized was there. He had been a boutique owner, but now he was a leader in a movement, fighting for the kind of change that would reshape an entire industry. And the journey wasn't over yet. The following month, Michael received a call that would change the course of his journey even further. It was from one of the most influential fashion industry boards, an organization he had always admired but never thought would take an interest in his boutique. The board wanted to meet with him to discuss a partnership that would help spread the message of inclusivity throughout the global fashion community. It was a huge opportunity, but it came with its own set of challenges. Michael had never thought about taking his movement beyond his boutique, let alone on an international scale. As he prepared for the meeting, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. The stakes were higher now, and this wasn't just about one event anymore. It was about continuing the work he had started and ensuring that the message of inclusivity, diversity, and empowerment wasn't just a trend, but a fundamental shift in the fashion industry's fabric. The meeting was held in a sleek, modern conference room with representatives from the board sitting across from him. They were all dressed impeccably, each one an established figure in the fashion world. The air in the room was thick with expectation as they began to speak with Michael. "We've seen the changes you've made, Mr. Matthews," one of the board members said, her voice measured but full of respect. "And we're impressed. What you did with the National Fashion Week wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. We believe there's an opportunity here to take this further. We want to partner with you to help spread your message to a global audience." Michael listened carefully, aware of the gravity of the moment. This was the kind of recognition he had only dreamed of, and the weight of the opportunity didn't escape him. They wanted him to help lead the charge in bringing inclusivity to fashion on a global scale. The idea of collaborating with such an influential group was both exhilarating and intimidating. But Michael had come so far. He had faced the doubts, the challenges, and the fears, and he knew this was the next step. "I'm honored," Michael replied, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "But I need to be clear about one thing. I'm not here to conform to the old ways of doing things. If we do this, it has to be real. It has to be about true change, not just another marketing ploy. We're building something that lasts, something that changes lives." The board members exchanged glances, and Michael could see that they respected his stance. They were on the same page, and that gave him confidence. He wasn't about to sacrifice his vision for the sake of corporate approval. If they were going to work together, it had to be on his terms, terms that aligned with the values he had fought so hard to establish. After a few more discussions about logistics and details, the board extended the partnership offer. Michael agreed, but he made sure that the focus of their collaboration would always be on creating lasting change. They would be allies in this movement, not just partners in business. As he left the meeting, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the beginning of something even bigger than he had imagined. The world was watching, and now he had the chance to shape the future of fashion on a global stage. The announcement of Michael's new partnership with the fashion board sent shockwaves through the industry. The media couldn't get enough of the story, how a boutique owner had not only transformed his business, but had sparked a movement that was now poised to go global. The partnership promised to bring the message of inclusivity to major fashion hubs around the world, including Paris, Milan, and New York. Michael knew that this was the kind of opportunity that could make the changes he had worked for go beyond his store, impacting the entire fashion landscape. As the global tour began to take shape, Michael faced a new set of challenges. The stakes were higher now, and the scrutiny was intense. His vision, which had seemed so clear and simple within the confines of his boutique, was now being tested on an international scale. Each city they entered came with its own set of expectations and pressures. Would the fashion world, traditionally so resistant to change, truly embrace the message of inclusivity? But Michael was determined. With every step, he kept reminding himself of why he was doing this, not for fame or recognition, but for the designers who had struggled for years to be seen, for the models who had been excluded, and for the customers who had always felt that the fashion world wasn't made for them. He knew that this was bigger than him. This was about showing the world that fashion, in all its forms, could be a space of creativity and freedom, not exclusion and conformity. The first stop on their global tour was Paris, the heart of the fashion industry. The event there was met with a mix of excitement and skepticism. Michael knew that Paris, with its long-standing traditions and exclusivity, would be the toughest crowd to win over. But when the show began, something unexpected happened. The audience, filled with high-profile designers, influencers, and industry leaders, was captivated. The collections showcased in Paris were bold, daring, and unapologetically diverse. Models from all walks of life graced the runway, and the response was overwhelming. For the first time, the fashion world was witnessing a new kind of beauty, a beauty that didn't fit the narrow mold it had once defined. As the final model walked the runway in Paris, Michael stood backstage, watching as the crowd erupted into applause. He felt a rush of pride, but he also felt something deeper, a sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a fashion show, it was a movement, and he had led it every step of the way. Paris had embraced his vision. Now, it was time for the rest of the world to do the same. As the global tour continued, Michael began to see just how much impact his movement was having on the fashion world. After Paris, the next stop was Milan and then New York. Each city brought its own challenges and unique atmosphere, but one thing was clear: the world was ready for change. The fashion elites, who had long prided themselves on their exclusivity and status, were beginning to see that the future of fashion wasn't about holding on to outdated ideals. It was about embracing a broader, more inclusive vision. Milan was particularly important. Known for its long-standing tradition of high fashion, the city's runway shows had often been criticized for their lack of diversity. Michael knew this was going to be a turning point. It wasn't just about showcasing new designers anymore, it was about making a statement. When the event kicked off in Milan, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. The audience, filled with the crème de la crème of the fashion world, was skeptical. Would they be open to seeing something different? Would they embrace the models who represented a new era of beauty? Michael watched from the sidelines as the first models stepped onto the runway. They were tall, short, slim, curvy, black, white, Asian, and Latino, representing a cross-section of society that had been ignored for far too long. As the collections unfolded, there was a shift in the room. The audience, who had initially looked on with reserve, began to soften. Applause grew louder, and the atmosphere changed from cold indifference to warmth. For the first time, fashion in Milan was about more than the clothes. It was about the message those clothes were sending. By the end of the show, Michael could see that the narrative was shifting. People were talking, not just about the designs, but about the inclusive nature of the event. Models, designers, and customers were seeing a future where fashion was open to everyone. Milan had always been a beacon of fashion, and now it was embracing a new kind of beauty. The final stop on the global tour was New York, a city that had long been considered the epicenter of the fashion world. If Milan had been a challenge, New York was going to be the ultimate test. It was the city where the biggest names in fashion had built their empires. Would they accept Michael's message, or would they try to resist the change he was bringing? The show in New York was held at a prestigious venue in Manhattan, And as Michael looked out over the audience, he knew that this was the moment where everything could either fall into place or crumble. But as the lights dimmed and the first model walked the runway, Michael was filled with a quiet confidence. He had done the work. He had created a movement that was bigger than the fashion shows, bigger than the designers. It was about changing the culture of an entire industry. The audience in New York, which had initially been skeptical, began to respond in the same way the crowds had in Paris and Milan. The applause started slow, but as the models strutted down the runway in stunning, diverse designs, the cheers grew louder. Fashion editors, influencers, and celebrities who had previously dismissed the idea of inclusivity in the industry were now on their feet, applauding not just the designs, but the message they carried. By the end of the show, Michael realized that this wasn't just a moment of personal success. It was a victory for everyone who had been denied a seat at the table. The global fashion industry, which had once been exclusive and narrow-minded, was now beginning to open up. Michael had succeeded in doing what no one had expected. He had transformed the fashion world, not just with the clothes, but with the power of inclusivity and diversity. As he stood backstage, surrounded by designers, models, and his team, Michael felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. This was it, the culmination of everything he had worked for. But he knew that this was just the beginning. The work wasn't over yet, and he was more committed than ever to ensuring that fashion remained a space for all people, regardless of who they were or where they came from. In the years that followed, Michael Matthews became a symbol of the new wave of fashion, a movement that had shattered the old barriers and embraced a world of inclusivity, diversity, and creativity. His boutique, which had once been a small business catering to a niche market, had grown into a global brand that stood for something much bigger than fashion. It was a brand that represented change, progress, and the power of unity. Michael's influence in the fashion world had reached far beyond the runway. He had become a mentor to countless designers, many of whom had struggled to gain recognition in an industry that had too often ignored them. He had shown them that talent, no matter where it came from or who it came from, deserved a platform. And in doing so, he had created a space where fashion could truly thrive, unburdened by the constraints of prejudice and exclusion. But Michael never lost sight of the core values that had driven him in the first place. He remained committed to ensuring that fashion remained accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy elite. His boutique continued to champion emerging designers and models, providing them with the opportunity to be seen and heard in a world that had once overlooked them. As he stood in his boutique one afternoon, watching a new generation of designers come through the doors, Michael realized that everything had changed. He had done what no one thought was possible. He had transformed an entire industry. And in doing so, he had created something that would last far beyond the runways, something that would change the world. Looking back at the journey that had started with Mrs. Harper's challenge, Michael smiled. He had never imagined that his journey would lead him here, to this moment, to this success. But he also knew that it was just the beginning. Fashion, like the world, was constantly evolving, and he was ready to continue leading the way. The world had changed, and Michael Matthews had been at the forefront of that change.